Hit the record button. Great, thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to the final faculty seminar of the fall of 2022 on behalf of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law Future Law Project. I am Mike Madison, the host of this series, and I'm here simply to welcome everybody and to welcome and introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Emily Postan of the University of Edinburgh Law School, and she is here to talk as a bioethicist about her recent book and things extending from her recent book. And let me get the title of it accurately. Of course, she'll have it on her slides in a moment. Embodied Narratives, Protecting Identity Interests Through Ethical Governance of Bioinformation. I'll turn the microphone over to Emily in a moment. She'll have the floor for give or take 30 minutes until a little bit past half past the hour, more or less. And at that point, I will moderate a question and answer session until the top of the hour. So with that very, very abbreviated information, welcome to Emily. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. And I will mute myself and turn the screen over to her.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you enormously to both you and Lisa for inviting me here to speak today. It's a unexpected and unlooked for joy of the difficult COVID years that we get to relatively unthinkingly accept invitations for speaking engagements all over the world and be with people and make connections and meet new friends and colleagues that way. So it's a joy to be here, and thank you to all of you who are attending and have given up afternoon research time and work time to listen to what I'm going to say. So as Mike said, I'm based in a law school, but I'm a bioethicist, and my training is in philosophy, and the kind of work that I do and the kind of work that I'm going to talk to you about today is empirically informed, although I don't myself do empirical research, conceptual bioethics. The kind of bioethics I tend to look at is forensically interrogating the nature of the interests we have as human beings, things that make our lives go well, and identifying and clarifying what we mean when we talk about particular interests that people might have. And for a number of years now, the area I particularly focused on is looking at our interests in constructing our own identities. And when I'm talking about identity today, I'm talking about kind of self-characterization, the who we really are question, rather than kind of logical questions of identity as might arise, talking about identity papers or something like that, or forensic identity questions. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'll show you the right screen. There we go. Right, I hope that is the correct screen that you're seeing now. So this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to talk about. And as Mike said, the topic of this seminar is inspired by a book that was published in July, and in a nutshell, the question I'm going to talk about is, or the issue I'm going to address is. Let me see if it's going to let me scroll through these. There we go. Is the question of why we need to take really seriously the impacts on our identities of encounters with what, for brevity, I will call personal bioinformation. And what I mean by this is information about our health, about our bodies, about our biology and our biological relationships. And when I'm talking about encounters, I'm talking about instances in which other people are in control of, or in possession of, and a position to either reveal or withhold information about me as an embodied and biological being. So this might be clinicians, it might be researchers, it might be those developing technological applications. I'm just going to see, I wonder if my I think my emails might beep a bit, but I'm really sorry about that. Okay, I'm not going to turn it off now. So I am looking at questions of why it might be important to think about when we should have access to information about our own bodies, and why this might play a significant role in the construction of our identities. During the course of this talk, I'm going to largely stick to the topic of my book, which is this idea of disclosures of information and access to information. But I'm also going to broaden it out a bit at the end by saying some of the something about my new research interests, which are to do more with the impacts on identity of being categorized according to bioinformation, and particularly categorized by machine learning applications. But before we get there, I'm going to say a bit more about what the landscape looks like, the legal governance, ethical landscape looks like in terms of when and why we have access to information of this kind about our health, our bodies, our biology, and biological relationships by way of context to what I'll go on to argue. So in the UK, and I'd be really interested to hear any differences that you might reflect upon in the US context, there are some legal entitlements to get access to information of these kinds, bioinformation. There's some limited access entitlements under the GDPR and the Data Protection Act, subject access rights they're called. They're not unlimited, they're quite constrained. And there's also quite specific entitlements under the Human Rights Act to get access to one's own health records, insofar as they are recorded and in a form that can be handed over like that. And then more generally, maybe most familiar, we encounter information about prognostic, diagnostic, risk information just during the course of care, healthcare. A bit more of a question mark, which I'll return to at several points, about the extent to which participation in health research, health-related research, gives us access to findings, not general findings of the study as a whole, but findings about us as individual participants. I'll come back to talk about that in a moment. Similarly, there are partial and contested entitlements to know information about our family members' genetic status. So, for example, there's been recent case law in the UK about the extent to which a family member is entitled to be told of a relative's genetic diagnosis when that relative refuses to give permission. And then increasingly, and it's only getting one bullet point on this slide, but takes up more space and isn't taking up increasing space, we are gaining information about the functions, the states, the future, past, current states of our bodies and our biology through medical devices, implanted medical devices, for example, those giving alerts to onset of seizure or monitoring our blood glucose, and then away from into the more kind of lifestyle devices and well-being devices, away from the more clearly medical ones. We're gaining information about, for example, our quality of sleep or our levels of physical activity from devices like Fitbits, wearable well-being devices, and also increasingly through our engagement with social media, whether that's through interventions from platforms like Facebook that conduct analysis of our online behaviors and maybe intervene by sending messages to give us health improvement advice, or by the way the algorithms on TikTok sort the content we see so that we're fed more information about, for example, ADHD diagnosis, if that's something we've shown an interest in. So apart from these legal entitlements under the GDPR and the Human Rights Act, the kind of considerations that are mainly driving and informing our access to information about our own biology are the protection of our health. Doctors, clinicians tell us stuff because they think it is important to help our health journey, or because, and this is where I return to the research participants getting individual findings as a result of participation. This is very limited generally to results that are seen to that would enable critical health or reproductive decision making of a serious condition, and that it would be really necessary for those results to be shared in order to enable that kind of decision making. And the same goes for sharing of familial genetic data. So they're kind of constrained circumstances, constrained and limited kinds of interests are recognized as instrumental here. And then obviously in the realm of devices and social media, there's a kind of mixture of consumer demand and commercial interests playing into what kind of information we get. Sometimes these are fenced in by, for example, the kind of tests that direct consumer genomics services can offer. The FDA has been activist to some extent in making sure that the only high quality tests that are not misleading can be marketed to consumers. And then on the kind of countervailing side, so those are reasons why we might be allowed to get information. On the other side, there is evidence that avoidance of psychological harm is often a limiting factor. It's a limiting factor in our data protection subject access rights. It's a limiting factor when it comes to screening programs being rolled out. If the results would be highly ambiguous or unclear, often psychological harm is cited as a reason not to run screening programs. And then, for example, feedback of research findings, it might be the sheer cost and burden to a research program of doing that kind of individual feedback that might be a factor militating against it. I say all this, and I probably spent too long on it, by way of saying what is conspicuous by its absence from these entitlements and the interests and principles underlying them. Conspicuous by its absence is attention to what this information might mean, how it might change how we think about who we are, what it might mean for our identities. And that's where my kind of bullseye focus is. One exception notable in the UK, and again, I'd be really interested to hear about any other international perspectives that widen it beyond this, is that in Europe, under European human rights law, there is a right to know one's origins, which is broadly construed sometimes as social work records of one's upbringing, but the most of the case law is about genetic parentage. And it's held broadly that there's a vital interest in uncovering the truth about an important aspect of one's identity via knowing one's genetic parentage. And this aspect of European human rights law has specifically fed into the UK context in the context of the removal of donor anonymity in the case of donor conception. So there is now, it's now required that donor conceived individuals treated in UK licensed clinics are entitled to know the identity of their donors when they reach adulthood. So this is one area of law in which access to personal bioinformation does seem to be very closely linked to identity interests in the jurisprudence, but also in the kind of discourse amongst policymakers and regulators. The fertility regulator in the UK has made statements about the identity importance of information about one's donor conception and one's gamete donors. So this is the kind of thing that piqued my interest. It was both, it seemed like, oh, there's something interesting here. Why is this kind of information seen as important to identity? And isn't it a bit strange that it's only the idea that genetic parentage would be crucial to identity, but not other kinds of information about how we came to be, how our bodies work, who we're related to, and so forth. So that set me off on my inquiry, which started many years ago and ended up with the monograph recently published. So I'm going to go back to that. So when if you look at empirical research, so as I say, I'm not an empirical researcher myself, but there is a really rich vein of literature that looks up and reports the views and experiences of donor conceived individuals and how they feel about having been denied or having encountered information about their donor conception and the identities of their gamete donors. And not without exception, but to a notable degree, people express a identity related wish to have known. They are pleased that they know, but for identity reasons, or they report that having found out was in some sense catastrophic or pivotal for how they feel about how they identify, how they describe themselves. And this literature is kind of richest in the area of donor conception, research with donor conceived individuals. But if you also look, as I do in the book, at literature around, for example, genetic testing for susceptibility to breast and ovarian cancer, the carriers of the BRCA mutation. Also, if you look at some of the literature around testing for another mutation that's associated with Alzheimer's risk, and in a slightly different field, evidence of neurophysiological correlates of psychiatric illness, you get emerging a kind of similar story that people, not always for good, sometimes it is experienced as an identity, assault on their identity to encounter these kinds of information. But there is a linkage between the significance of encountering these kinds of personal bioinformation and it having an impact on how people describe themselves, how they characterize themselves, the stories that they tell about who they are. And now onto the slide that I flicked onto earlier prematurely, because what happens when this empirical evidence and indeed statements of the kind made by the European Court, that there's a vital interest in knowing who your genetic parents are, where they hit bioethics, you get a kind of binary and a quite polarized debate about what it might mean for bioinformation to be valuable and important to our identities. On one hand, you get a kind of naive essentialism that's maybe evident in that quote from the European Court of Human Rights, that somehow knowing things about your body, knowing your genetic parentage, knowing about your genetic susceptibilities to particular conditions or disorders or traits is essential to kind of uncovering the real you. So there's sometimes that kind of proposition is put forward. And then that meets quite vehement objections at the kind of softest end of the repudiation of that essentialist position, the idea that we have an essence and bioinformation allows us to look inside the box and find out what that essence is. At the softest end of repudiating that is a kind of, well, yeah, this information is interesting. It's an optional way of thinking about who you are, describing yourself, but it's in no sense particularly more important or less important than any other kind of way of describing yourself. It's maybe an interesting textual detail. Bit more vehemently pushing back against that essentialist picture is the kind of suggestion that to say that knowledge of our bodies and our biology has something to do with our identity is a kind of category mistake. You kind of fallen into the mistake of thinking that what's true about yourself as a material object in the world is also something to do with about who you really are. And that is a mistake to conflate those two things. At the most vehement end of repudiating that essentialist picture is the argument that to think that our biological traits, our health status is something to do with our identity is reductive and limiting, and in some circumstances highly oppressive, and could be stigmatizing. For example, if it implies that someone who doesn't know who their genetic parents are, that they are somehow incomplete or kind of living a lie, then that is stigmatizing and a form of harm. So I'm frustrated by the fact that the choice seems to be between kind of naive essentialism or these kind of there's no value and perhaps even sincere harm in using biological information to think about who we are. And it seems to me there must be some space between those. And that's the space that I try and characterize and sketch out in my work. And my argument in I'll unpack this more, but in a kind of nutshell, is that access to bioinformation is ethically significant to the extent that it helps us build an intelligible, resilient, inhabitable, comfortably inhabitable story about who we are. Identity narrative. I'll say a bit more about what I mean by an identity narrative in a moment. And this is constructing an identity narrative with these characteristics matters because it has real practical and personal significance to be in a position to do so. And that's what, if you'll bear with me for some theorizing, this is what I'm going to explain now. So, lots of people in lots of different disciplines talk about narrative identity. It's terminology that's used in psychology and sociology and in philosophy. And that's where the kind of roots of my conceptual picture come from, particularly the work of Mariah Schechtman, amongst others, is this idea of narrative self-constitution. And to simplify that, what this means is that we all have a sense, the proposal is, of who we are, a story we tell about who we are. It's not an absolutely comprehensive biography. It's more like a selected, edited, interpreted, filtered account of our defining characteristics, the experiences that really make us who we are, the relationships that shape us. And this is a temporally extended story. It looks backwards. Who were we? Who are we now? Who do we anticipate that we will become? And it is it's always evolving. And it's a story that we tell ourselves, but we do it alongside and supported by or contradicted by and woven through the stories that others tell about us. So it's our story, but it's importantly relational in these key ways. And the key feature of these self-narratives is that they're not merely a story we tell about who we are already. We're not describing an identity that exists independently of the story. We constitute ourselves through the story we develop. And so who we are evolves and changes as that story evolves and changes. So that's the kind of strongest claim of narrative identity theory, is that this is actually, we are self-creating through our narratives. Another distinctive and strong claim that's important for what I'll go on to say is that our identity narratives are not inert. They perform a kind of practical function, in that to the extent we tell our story and understand our story of who we are, this performs particular functions. It allows us to understand who we are, to have a sense of who we are. It provides us a framework within which to develop our values, our modes of interpreting the world and engaging with the world. And its extended diachronic nature allows us to engage in having long-term projects, long-term commitments, long-term relationships. So we're anchored temporally by the fact we have this sense of a narrative unfolding with a history and a prospective future. And so in these ways, it also provides the foundations for our authorship of our own actions and our own lives. It's the foundation of our autonomy. So in short, there's a lot at stake in developing one's self-narrative. And it's not something we just have, it's something we work on and we develop and we refine. And attached to that idea of working on and refining our identity narrative are some kind of normative constraints that apply to the kind of narrative that can perform these functions of allowing us to have self-understanding and having a framework within which to engage with the world and develop our priorities and our values. And these are kind of light conditions upon what an identity narrative can look like. It can't just be a fanciful fabrication. It has to have some internal coherence, so it makes sense to us. And it needs to have some kind of coherence with the world as we experience it and as others around us experience it, so that we can meaningfully occupy and attest to this narrative in the real world and in the social realm. And it's those kind of internal and relational, external kind of coherence and intelligibility that allows an identity narrative to perform these practical agency grounding functions. So there's something ethically important in being able to constitute an intelligible, coherent self-narrative, and it's an undertaking, it's an achievement to be able to do so. Perfect coherence, no doubt out of our reach, but an ongoing quest in that direction. So what we've got is this normative conception of identity construction. What has this got to do with bioinformation? Lots of theories of narrative identity construction don't pay that much attention to the body and biology and the embodied nature of our existence. As I mentioned before, there's a tendency to think that it's a kind of category mistake, that it's just our kind of lump and bodies are to do with bioinformation, and the kind of self-creating, narrating self is to do with our cognitive dispositions and our personality traits. But this seems to me to really do a violence to what it is to be a human, and the kind of humans we are, living the kind of lives we lead, and creating the kind of identity stories that we do. Our health, our biological relationships, the enabling and limiting natures of our bodies and how they're formed and how they work, how well they are, their dimensions. These are already key parts of the stories we tell about who we are, and they are shaping and limiting the nature of the stories that we're capable of telling. And this is why, it seems to me, why bioinformation is important, because it performs both a role in helping us make sense of our embodied experiences, but also helps us create identity narratives that themselves are suitable frameworks and vehicles through which to navigate and interpret our embodied experiences, and are resilient in the face of the kind of onslaught of embodied experiences. So if we just take one example, if we look at the findings of social science research that's been done with people deciding whether to undergo testing for the BRCA mutation, which is associated with an elevated risk of breast and ovarian cancer, it's apparent that many of the people thinking about whether they're going to have a BRCA test, that breast and ovarian cancer are already part of their stories of who they are. They're part of their family histories. They're part of their awareness of what has happened to family members who've become ill, part of their stories insofar as they have had caring responsibilities for family members. So BRCA-related cancers are already in their narrative. And then the option of being tested to see whether they themselves are a BRCA carrier then may be received in various ways as a way of planning emotionally and practically for future disease, for dealing with the kind of existential uncertainty of not knowing whether they are a BRCA carrier or not. It can help them think about, understand, and have a different relationship and connection to the experiences that maybe their mothers or sisters who've lived with BRCA-related cancers have come through. It can help them obviously in thinking about how to plan for their health and how they might take protective and preventative measures against future illness. and maybe reflecting upon what their future plans might be, their future family making plans, and so forth. So this feeds into my core set of claims that bioinformation can help play an interpretive role in supporting the development of narratives that make sense and are resilient in the face of the onslaught of embodied experience, and also help us make sense of and navigate those embodied experiences. But with the caveat that I'm not saying this is not an essentialist argument that we need this information to understand who we already are. Sometimes this information won't be necessary. Some people very decisively do not want to undergo BRCA testing. They're not interested in what that might do for their understanding of who they are and their life as it unfolds into the future. They reject that information. It's not part of who they are. And for some people who undergo testing, the experience is not one of building a more resilient and intelligible and inhabitable self-narrative, but quite the opposite. It could be one of increased fear and alienation from the sense of who they were before. So my claim is not that personal bioinformation plays a necessary role, nor yet always a positive one, but that it has the potential to play a number of really significant and ethically significant roles in the construction of an identity narrative. So this is to kind of take stock of my core argument so far. So developing an inhabitable, embodied identity narrative matters, but it's not an inevitability. It's something that is this process of, it's the result of an interpretive and sense-making process. And encounters with personal bioinformation can have significant impacts, both good and bad, on this quality of inhabitability and intelligibility of our self-narratives. And thus, encounters with this information engages significant interests, ethically significant interests, and these interests need to be given appropriate and serious consideration when it comes to the generation, the governance, the communication of personal bioinformation to the people that it concerns. So what does this mean in practice? I'm going to talk about kind of three broad areas in which I think this has practical application. The most immediately apparent of these is that I think that I listed the kind of the information governance landscape up in my second slide. Currently, whether we are offered individual research findings following participation in a research study, whether a relative's refusal of access to their own genetic test results that might have implications for my health, whether their lack of consent to share is overridden. These things come down to considerations of clinical actionability, the seriousness of the condition from a clinical perspective, and the countervailing considerations of privacy, of confidentiality, of the risk of emotional distress. And I just want to say that identity interests should be part of that suite of considerations. They should have kind of equal billing with the other instrumental and long-standing bioethical concerns with privacy, autonomy, clinical actionability. So this doesn't necessarily mean more disclosures. This doesn't mean that identity interests will always mean tell people more. We still need to weigh the costs and benefits of disclosures on identity grounds against other countervailing considerations. It's part of the balance. It's not a trump card. I think it's also the case that we need to recognize that sometimes identity harms are consequent upon communication of bioinformation. And paradigmatically, the kind of two examples of harmful bioinformation could be those information that is misleading that is easily misinterpreted and could lead people to invest identity significance erroneously in information that doesn't tell someone what it purports to, or where it is stigmatizing or limiting or derogatory in certain ways. So, for example, I'm suggesting that identity interests might mean consideration of greater feedback of research findings, but the example I turn to when I think about where might it lead to more cautious, more conservative information disclosure norms, something like direct consumer genomics seems to be an area where we're not careful enough about the negative identity impacts of the information that's made readily available to the paying consumer. And not only are we not careful enough, but these direct consumer genomics companies are able to advertise their services in terms of find out the true you, these kind of essentialist claims that mean that they're potentially feeding limiting essentialist discourses about what it is to be an author of one's own identity and what kinds of traits and characteristics one can indeed decide to not incorporate into our descriptions of who we are. So we've got questions about when to disclose. I'm saying should incorporate identity considerations, but also how to disclose. So identity making is itself an inherently interpretive endeavor, and thus it seems important that the way that we encounter information that could have identity significance and the nature of the identity significance it has will turn on the way in which this information is communicated to us. And this, again, I think has really interesting implications for the more automated and consumer-driven encounters with information we have through DTC services and through wearable devices, where necessarily currently the interpretive, supportive information disclosure is absent because we are assailed directly by that information. I'm conscious of time running quickly, so I just want to say two quickly more areas in which we want to think about information governance in ways that could be protective of our identity interests. And the second of these is what I'm calling upstream considerations. So my book focuses on managing and think about how we manage disclosures of access to information about our bodies and biology. But before we even get to these questions of access, we're looking at the way that information is framed as being identity relevant in the first place. So I think there are also imperatives to look at, for example, the way that, if not research studies themselves, but the way that they are presented, for example, in press releases, particularly neuro research and genetic research, that engage in a kind of essentialist rhetoric around, you know, the brains of offenders are different from those of non-offenders, that kind of language which forecloses the sense of understanding who we are in terms of our bodies in more narrative, autonomous ways, and is more limited in the way that the essentialists fear bioinformation might be. And maybe at the most stark end of that spectrum, thinking about kind of the abuses of genetic science in, for example, what's sometimes called race science, where it's the framing of biological traits in ways that are that attempt maliciously to reify and naturalize difference in a way that is intended to be discriminatory and stigmatizing. So we need to think about how science is used in ways that implies direct connections, necessary connections between identity and biology. And finally, very briefly, this is my new area of research, which I'm moving into now, which is closely related to that upstream considerations under point 2 there, which is to think about the extent to which the way that bioinformation is used to categorize humans, and how those category labels, whether it's ADHD sufferer, whether it's donor-conceived individual, whether it's someone at elevated risk of cancer, the way those categories are themselves tools of self-description and narrative self-constitution. And I'm particularly interested, and I'd be really interested in making connections with anyone in the room today who might be working on topics could be relevant to this, the way that machine learning and deep learning analysis of big health data to generate these kinds of categories of people might play in different and novel ways into our identity projects, precisely because the categories are not derived from historical clinical practices they have been, but are derived from machine learning and algorithmic functions. So I think that's the area I'm moving into thinking about now, is where the tools of identity making are taken out of human practice and human hands to a great extent, or to some extent, and are automated in this way. What do those descriptors we're left with? Do we relate to them? Do they play into our identity practices in novel or interesting ways? So I'm aware that I have spoken for long enough. So that just remains for me to say thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to hearing what you might have to say about this. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily. We've got about 15 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes for some Q&A, and I don't want to monopolize the time, even though I have lots of questions of my own. So let me open the floor. If people want to wave their hand or raise their Zoom hands with questions, we'll start off. Sana.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much. That was a really fascinating talk. I was just wondering, Emily, what are your views on how this sense of self, the self-narrative that you've talked about, how that's developed or perhaps maintained against technological advancements like neural interfacing that can alter impulses, cognition, and perhaps make us behave in ways we normally wouldn't have? And that's really challenging the concepts of agency and control and self. And a second point on your sort of talk about the categorizations of self, that's really interesting as well, because I always sort of seem to think that the way technological advancement is moving, we have things like mechanized limbs where you can maybe use brain impulses to control those elements. They're almost like an extension of your body, yourself. And so, you know, there are perhaps like an evolution of the species occurring as we speak, perhaps not in this decade, but definitely in the next few decades. So that also really challenges what we think of a self-narrative right now compared to what it could turn into. So yeah, keen to hear your thoughts.
Those are fantastic questions, Sana. Thank you. So to the first one, so there is, as I'm sure you're aware, there is quite a lot of noise and literature around, for example, deep brain stimulation and the way that personality changes and behavioral changes that are associated with deep brain stimulation therapy, whether they represent a challenge, whether they represent a challenge to identity, the continuity, whether people become new people, whether there's basically a fracture in the continuity of someone's identity if these behavioral and personality changes are significant enough. I think narrative identity theory, it gives us a really useful and interesting way of approaching this. Françoise Baylis has written about this well, is that if we are capable of telling a story which can incorporate these changes to my defining characteristics or my characteristic behaviors or my experiences, or if I can make sense of the fact they're attributable to a neurointervention, that becomes part of a coherent story, albeit a coherent story with a dramatic and challenging intervention that may require some painful or effortful reconfiguration and reimagining of who we are. Narrative identity creates that space. Narrative identity approach creates that space to understand that it needn't be a bifurcation, that it can be an incorporation, understanding, and a reflection upon the reasons and nature of the changes. Where there isn't that reflective space, where the person cannot take a step back from how the neurointervention might have affected their their defining characteristics, or the course and nature of the narrative they're telling, that is much more problematic. And I think sometimes we will have to say that people's the intelligibility and the inhabitability of someone's narrative does maybe suffer some kind of crisis, or a sharp turn in tone or content. And I think this is also what narrative identity framework offers, is a way of understanding that identity narrative is not just something we all have. It's normative. It's something that we hope goes well in certain ways, and sometimes it doesn't go well in certain ways, and that really matters. And then your second one. So yeah, assistive devices and integration of prostheses and so forth. I think that's where I always feel like I talk about embodiment and then talk about biology and at the same time. And embodiment is obviously much more than biology. So I think sometimes I make much too fast a move there. I guess my project started thinking about why is biological information important, and embodiment was part of the answer to that. But embodiment goes much further than biology. And I think the extent to which the kind of extended physical self does become part of our way of relating to and navigating our environment and our kind of our habitus, then assisted devices and prosthetics are part of our embodied story too.
Fabulous. Thank you. Shelley.
Hi, Emily. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Thank you. It was super interesting. I wanted to, I guess, ask about broader implications of your arguments. It seems to me that you mostly focused, and you know, in one of the last slides, you also said that you mostly focus on what kind of information, or whether we should disclose information to individuals themselves. So the focus is on disclosure to the individual. And I guess I'm wondering about the other side of the spectrum, which is disclosure and use by other stakeholders related to you know, personal information, genetic information, health information, because obviously the argument on identity has implications on that, because if we essentially feel that the information is part of our identity, that implies that there should be more control over what, you know, how other may use the information. And if I read correctly your argument, so it seems that you take kind of for granted the current situation that genetic origin, you know, is part of our identity, and you take this and you want to apply this rationale to information more broadly, information more broadly, and that leads you to the conclusion that the current regulation, like the GDPR, provides limited protection regarding, you know, what kind of control people should have in terms of the information. And I guess my question is, what's the ultimate goal for you with this argument? Is it to achieve exclusive control over personal information? And if so, are you not concerned that this leads us to a very individualistic society? And it's interesting for me to hear, you know, someone who is based in Europe, which, you know, seems to be more communitarian rather than the US, which is more individualistic. So I'm interested to hear if this is the purpose of the arguments, and if not, did you think about a more nuanced approach to how, you know, govern this information, whether, for instance, we should think about different types of information. You spoke about information more broadly, but whether we should differentiate maybe between health information and genetic information, or whether, you know, some entities could have more control than others in different contexts. So yeah, that's.
Thanks, Shelley. That's that's loads to think about and really, really, really useful. So first thing, I'm sure, I really hope I can persuade you that I don't think this is about individualistic control. And I also don't, I feel bad because I feel like I want to say I don't. One thing is, I don't think I'm suggesting that information is part of our identity, in that because it plays a part in our narrative, that it's somehow more mine, and I have greater interest in controlling who else accesses it for that reason alone. It's quite the distinction I want to draw, that kind of puts clear blue water between the essentialist position that we must know this information because otherwise we wouldn't know the truth about ourselves, which I want to distance myself away from, is to say that for me, bioinformation is just a tool, but it's not a trivial tool because it helps us get a purchase on the nature and pitfalls and kind of future traps of our embodied existence. So it's just a tool. So even if something plays a really key role in our identity narrative, that doesn't mean that I have that it is my identity, or that I have exclusive interest and exclusive control over it. So I keep on saying control, except for, with one caveat, except for I will have interest to the extent that other people manipulate that information in ways that might harm me, use it use it in research with stigmatizing or repressive conclusions. I do have an interest in the trays with which I identify not being misused or distorted or used in kind of hurtful and harmful ways that would harm me and the story I tell about myself and those with whom I share that trait. So I have some limited interest in what other people do with my information, but not just because it's part of my story, because I don't see information as like a kind of plug-in building block to identity, but a kind of interpretive tool, if that's not pushing metaphors to do more work than we want them to. I hope I should have made it clearer that I don't think that genetic parentage or genetic origins has a particular claim on being identity relevant. It seems from the empirical literature that a lot of people with kind of first-hand interests in being denied or having delayed access to information about their genetic parentage, that they think it matters. But it is equally valid that a lot of donor conceived people say, my parents are the people who raised me. I have no interest in the person who donated the sperm or the eggs or the embryo. That's irrelevant to who I am. And that's true of them as well. So I'm not saying that there's no one category of bioinformation that is particularly necessary or relevant to our identities, but bioinformation as a whole, we need to pay attention to the fact that this isn't irrelevant to who we are. We are navigating biological lives. We are navigating embodied lives. And so as a big collective term, it's really important, whether knowing about cancer risk, genetic parentage, susceptibility to psychiatric illness is relevant to any individual is entirely contingent and open question. So from that, I also hope it makes sense to say that I don't see this as about individualistic control. On the contrary, I think it's precisely because we share traits with other people, biological histories, family histories with other people, that we have very deeply shared and deeply ingrained relational interests in why do I care about knowing about risk of Alzheimer's disease. A lot of people say it's because it helps them understand what their grandmothers went through, for example. So our identity interests are absolutely relational and intertwined and parasitic on our connections to other people. So I hope that gets me away from any misunderstanding that I've got an individualistic picture here. You may not agree that I've got away from that.
Well, so great. Thank you, Emily. So we've got a moment for a brief question and a brief response. So I'll turn over to Marielle.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I just wanted to ask, I work on this issue related to de-identification with a focus on cancer research as a use case, and inspired by the BRCA case also. And our work has its roots in labor ethics and theory, and specifically on the idea of data as labor and our focus on health data as labor, or biodata as labor. And I'm wondering what your, you mentioned some of the commercial uses of this information, and I'm wondering sort of where, from the legal or theoretical perspective, you've looked at the role of this as a means of production.
That's amazing. That's fascinating. I feel like a baby lamb, unable to use phrases like means of production and labor. They're so interested in me, and they're not language I feel comfortable using. So forgive me if I hope I'm not taking your point and running in the wrong direction with it. What I have been really interested in is, I think, a version of this in terms of people's investment in as research participants. So one of the kind of case studies which I've kind of run with most around this idea is why we might have an ethical, leaving aside the legal, entitlement to incidental and intended individual findings from participation in research studies. And it's because we have given our labor through participating in these studies, and we have bound our identities to these studies. They're often the motivation for taking part in BRCA studies or APOE studies for Alzheimer's, is because of our stories of who we are, family histories of disease, and our investment as participants in research feels like part of identity making labor itself, that I haven't got much more sophisticated beyond a kind of broad idea of reciprocity, and that's an added reason why there are reasons why we might expect to not be ignored when it comes to getting feedback about individual findings from research studies. I'd really like to think about this more, and I don't feel I've given you a satisfactory answer, but I think it's that participation research is the one area where I've thought about this kind of data as work, data as sending part of one's agency and one's identity out into the world for other people's epistemic questions, other people's commercial interests. So yeah.
Okay, we're probably going to have to cut it short there. I apologize. Thank you, Marielle. That you asked the question, a species of the thing that was preying on my mind as I was listening to Emily's talk. So we have to call a close to this. Before we shut off the recording, though, I do want to not only thank Emily for a superb and provocative talk. I also want to acknowledge Lisa Parker, who is with us today, and her contribution as director of Pitt's Center for Bioethics and Health Law, for introducing me to Emily and suggesting that she being recruited as a speaker for this. So thank you to Lisa for bringing Emily into our world. The conversation has to close for now, but look forward to Emily's future work and to this conversation, which has obviously elicited so much interest literally from around the world, which is one of the gifts that Zoom has given all of us. So we'll close it with that. Thank you, Emily. Thank you to all of you. Look to the website for the spring edition of the Future of Technology in Governance seminar series, and we'll hopefully see some of you then.